"Dad, take me to an orphanage, please," the little girl cried through her tears to the businessman. And when he returned from a business trip and checked the security cameras, he turned pale upon seeing that his daughter. The door slammed shut. Jimena felt the noise reverberate in her chest, as if the echo of that sound marked the final end of something she had tried to hold on to for too long. Her eyes remained fixed on the wood, and her small fingers trembled, clutching tightly to the fabric of her pajamas. Outside, Regina's footsteps faded down the hallway. Each step was like a whip striking her mind. She didn't cry. Not this time, because there were no more tears left, only the exhaustion of living in fear. In the living room, Gale rubbed his temples with his fingers. The tension in his head grew stronger every time he met his wife's gaze. Regina, impeccable as always, with her hair perfectly tied back and her dress without a single wrinkle, looked at him with a mix of annoyance and boredom. "You need to do something about her," Regina said, settling into the couch as if the matter was trivial. "We can't keep going like this, Gale. That girl is getting out of control." Gale closed his eyes for a moment. His breathing grew heavy. The last thing he wanted after an exhausting day was another argument about the same thing. "She's not a bad girl," he murmured. "She's just going through a rough time." Regina let out a dry laugh. "A rough time? Please. We've been married for 2 years, and not a single day has gone by without her treating me like her worst enemy. She yells at me, ignores me, defies me, and you let her." Gale's gaze hardened. There were moments when he doubted. He had grown up believing that family should be a refuge, a place of peace. But his home had turned into an invisible battlefield where every word felt like a bullet fired in the dark. "I'll talk to her," he finally said, standing up. Regina clicked her tongue and crossed her arms. "It won't change anything, Gale. You know that." He didn't respond. He walked down the hallway to Jimena's room and knocked softly on the door. "Zaim, can I come in?" Silence. He rested his forehead against the door. His knuckles knocked again, this time more firmly. "Please, open up." The handle turned slowly. The door opened just a few inches, enough for him to see his daughter's swollen, distrustful eyes. Gale felt a knot in his throat when he saw her dull expression, her tangled hair, and the traces of dried tears on her cheeks. How long had she been like this without him truly noticing? "Can I come in?" he asked. Jimena silently stepped aside. Gale entered, closing the door behind him. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and the ceiling light turned off. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, who stood with her arms crossed over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from something invisible. "What's going on, Zaim?" The girl looked away, pressing her lips together tightly. "I don't want to be here," she whispered. Gale's chest tightened. "Here in the house?" Jimena shook her head. Her lower lip trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "Here with her." A shiver ran down Gale's spine. It wasn't the first time Jimena had shown her rejection of Regina, but there was something in her tone, in the desperation hidden in her words, that deeply unsettled him. "Tell me the truth, Jimena. Has she done something to you?" The girl's eyes widened in surprise. She seemed torn between speaking and staying silent. "No," she finally answered, but her voice lacked conviction. Gale knew his daughter was lying. He knew something was wrong, but he had no proof, only his intuition screaming at him to pay attention. "Zaim, I want to help you, but I can't if you don't tell me what's going on," he insisted calmly. Jimena lowered her head and whispered something barely audible. "You're not going to believe me." Gale felt his heart beat faster. "Prove it to me." The girl lifted her gaze and looked at him with a sadness that didn't match her age. "Dad, take me to an orphanage." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His daughter, his little girl, was asking him to abandon her. Horror paralyzed him for a few seconds. "What are you saying, Jimena?" She took a deep breath and squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to gather the courage to continue speaking. "I'd rather be anywhere else than here. I don't want to live with her." Gale swallowed hard. "Did Regina do something to you?" Jimena clenched her fists. "Didn't you hear what I said? I don't want to be here." Gale felt a mix of anger and despair. His daughter was begging him to take her out of her own home, and he didn't understand why. Something inside him told him that Jimena wasn't exaggerating, that the fear in her eyes was real. But the thought that his wife could harm his daughter seemed impossible. "I'll fix this, Zyme. I promise." Jimena looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. "You can't promise that, Dad. You never listened to me." And with those words, she crawled into bed and turned her back to him. Gale stayed in the room, watching his daughter's small body, feeling more helpless than ever. When he left, he found Regina waiting for him in the hallway. Her arms were crossed, and her face showed a look of displeasure. "You can't keep allowing this," she said, exasperated. "She's manipulating you." Gale looked at her with a coldness he'd never felt before. "What did you do to her?" Regina laughed, surprised. "Me? Really? Are you falling for her game?" He didn't respond. He just walked past her, feeling that something in his world had broken that night. And the worst part was that he didn't even know how much more could be shattered. The night went on in an unsettling silence. Gale stayed in the living room, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the carpet. The house was calm, but inside him, everything was chaos. He couldn't shake the words his daughter had said. "Dad, take me to an orphanage." Something inside him screamed that he had ignored the signs for too long. For months, he'd chalked up Jimena's problems to adaptation, adolescence, the so-called rebellion that Regina assured him was normal. But what he'd just heard from his daughter wasn't a simple tantrum. It was desperation. It was a cry for help disguised as an impossible request. The hallway door opened with a soft sound. Regina appeared in the doorway, wearing her satin robe, arms crossed, and an expression that oscillated between worry and impatience. "Are you going to tell me what the hell is going on?" Gale looked up at her. "Why does Jimena want to leave the house?" Regina was silent for a moment. Then, she let out an exaggerated sigh and sat down on the couch in front of him. "I don't know what you expected. This isn't new, Gale. It's been like this for months. It's not the same." "Of course it is. It's always been the same. I try to get closer, but she hates me for no reason." Regina's voice trembled a bit, as if she were holding back a sob. Gale furrowed his brow. Something in her tone sounded forced, rehearsed. "I don't understand. It wasn't like this before." Regina lowered her gaze and pressed her lips together, as if carefully choosing her words. "Jimena has never accepted me. And frankly, I don't know how much more I can take." Gale felt a pang of guilt. "She's just a child." "Yes, a child who does everything she can to make my life miserable. She challenges me, ignores me, treats me like I'm her enemy." "Gale, you don't see it because you're never here." The blow was direct. Gale felt his muscles tense. "Don't say that." Regina smiled sadly. "Isn't it true? How much time do you spend with her?" The question disarmed him completely. "I work for both of us. And while you work, I'm the one dealing with Jimena. I'm the one who has to listen to her screams, her outbursts, her lies. And in the end, you only see what she wants you to see." Gale felt a knot in his stomach. He thought he knew everything about his daughter. But what if Regina was right? What if Jimena was exaggerating things? "I don't know what to do." Regina took his hands in hers. "Let me handle this. I can manage her." Her fingers were warm, but her gaze was cold. "I don't want you to manipulate her, Regina. I want them to get along." Regina pulled her hands away and stood up with a resigned sigh. "Then do something yourself. Because I'm already tired." Gale watched her leave the room and felt something inside him crack. Something nameless, but leaving him with a feeling of unease in his stomach. The next day, Gale woke up early. He stopped by Jimena's room before leaving for work, but the door was closed. He hesitated for a few seconds before knocking. "Zyme, can I come in?" There was no answer. "I'm going to open it." He turned the knob, and the door opened easily. The room was dim, the curtains closed. Jimena was sitting on the floor, her head resting on her knees. Gale felt a pang of worry. "Are you okay?" Jimena didn't lift her head. "Yes, I'm going to the office." "Do you want us to go out for dinner later?" "I don't want to go out." Gale stepped closer. "Zyme, we need to talk." Jimena looked up. Her eyes had a strange glint, as if she had been crying all night. I don't want to talk. Gail knelt in front of her. Are you afraid of something? Jimena bit her lip and looked away. No, it was a lie. Gail knew it instantly. But he didn't want to press her. If something is bothering you, you can tell me. Jimena nodded without conviction. Gail sighed. I'll find a way to fix this. The girl didn't answer. She just rested her head back on her knees. Gail felt like he was losing his daughter. And the worst part was that he didn't know how to stop it. That night, Gail came home later than expected. A project at the office had kept him busy. When he entered the house, he found Regina sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. You're late. I know. Regina gave him an ironic smile. Did you have dinner? No. Regina stood up and approached him slowly. You should relax. Gail smelled her perfume. Where's Jimena? Regina rolled her eyes. In her room. Like always. Gail headed down the hallway. Just as he was about to knock on Jimena's door, he noticed something on the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a pajama sleeve, with a dark stain on the fabric. Gail felt his blood freeze in his veins. He slammed the door open. Jimena was lying on the bed, facing away from him. He approached and noticed that her arm was out from under the blankets. Bruises. Small purple marks on her forearm. Gail's heart pounded in his chest. Zyme. Jimena moved slightly but didn't turn around. Gail gently took her arm. What happened here? Jimena tensed. Nothing. Nothing? How did you get this? Jimena pressed her lips together. I fell. Gail felt a chill run down his skin. You fell? Yes. It was a lie. He knew it. Jimena. Let it go, Dad. I don't want to talk about it. Gail clenched his jaw. He stood up and left the room. Regina was waiting for him in the hallway, arms crossed. What are you doing? Gail stared at her. How did she get those bruises? Regina shrugged. She falls all the time. She's clumsy. The response filled him with cold rage. Are you sure? Regina lifted her chin. Are you insinuating something? Gail didn't answer. He only felt that, for the first time, he was really seeing his wife. And what he saw terrified him. Gail stood still in the hallway. Regina was watching him with an unsettling calm, arms crossed, chin held high, as if her reaction was predictable. The tension settled between them like an invisible, suffocating gas. Are you insinuating something? Regina repeated, in that tone she used when she wanted him to feel ridiculous. Gail turned his gaze to the closed door of Jimena's room. The bruise on his daughter's arm was still etched in his mind, an image that tormented him and that he couldn't ignore. I'm not insinuating anything, he finally said. I just want to know what's going on when I'm not here. Regina let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes, as if she were dealing with an absurd waste of time. I already told you, Gail. The girl is clumsy. She trips all the time. But of course, as always, you only see what you want to see. Gail felt an impulse of anger rise inside him, but he held it back. He had no proof. He only had a bad feeling and his daughter's pleas echoing in his head. I'll leave early tomorrow, he murmured, walking past the room. Regina didn't respond, but when he closed the door, he could feel her still watching him from the hallway. The next day went by automatically. The morning routine, the cold coffee, the unbearable traffic. But the discomfort inside him remained constant. Before leaving for work, he stopped at the door of Jimena's room and hesitated. Finally, he knocked softly. Zyme, are you having breakfast? Silence. I'm coming in. He cautiously turned the handle and pushed the door open. Jimena was sitting on her bed, staring at the floor. Her hair fell in messy strands across her face. I'm not hungry, she murmured. Gail walked over to her, sat beside her, and observed her small hands clasped together in her lap. I'm going away for a few days. Jimena nodded slightly. I'll be back in a week. Another slight nod. Gail felt something break inside him. Zyme? She looked up for the first time. Her dark eyes seemed to ask for help, but there was something else there, a resignation that made him shiver. What's wrong, Dad? Gail swallowed. Are you sure everything is okay when I'm not here? Jimena opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment, they heard the sound of heels approaching. Regina appeared in the doorway with an impassive smile. Are you joining us for breakfast, Zyme? Gale watched his daughter's reaction. The way her body tensed immediately, how her fingers tightened on her lap. I'm not hungry, she repeated, not looking at Regina. Gale stood up and gave his daughter one last glance before leaving the room. He knew something wasn't right, and now he was determined to find out the truth. Before leaving, Gale installed hidden cameras in the house. It wasn't something he felt good about doing, but he could no longer trust what he saw at face value. He placed a small device in the living room, another in the hallway, and one more in the kitchen. He knew he couldn't install anything in Jimena's room without raising suspicions, but he hoped what was recorded would be enough to give him answers. As he left the house, Regina kissed him on the cheek and hugged him tightly. We're going to miss you, she whispered, with an almost affectionate tone. Gale didn't respond. He simply got into the car and left. As soon as the door to the house closed behind him, Regina's smile vanished. She slowly turned toward the hallway, where Jimena had come out of her room and was watching her warily. Do you have something to say to me? Regina asked, her voice cold. Jimena shook her head, not daring to meet her gaze. Fine, then you know what you have to do. Jimena pressed her lips together, lowered her head, and returned to her room without making a sound. That night, the sound of the TV in the living room filled the silence of the house. Regina drank from a glass of wine while her eyes scanned the screen with little interest. Jimena tried to read a book in her room, but her hands were shaking. Fear was a weight in her chest, keeping her from breathing. Suddenly, the sound of the TV abruptly turned off. Jimena felt her body tense up. The house fell into complete silence. She heard Regina's footsteps coming slowly down the hallway. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps stopped right in front of her door. Jimena shut her eyes tightly and gripped the sheets between her fingers. The doorknob turned. The door opened. Regina stood in the doorway, looking at her with that inscrutable expression that always made her feel small. Come here. Jimena didn't move. I told you to come here. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a firmness that paralyzed her. Jimena got out of bed and walked slowly toward her. Regina tilted her head. Do you know why I'm here? Jimena shook her head. Regina smiled coldly. Because I need to remind you of something. Jimena felt a lump in her throat. Your dad trusts me. He loves me. And if you say anything, if you put weird ideas in his head. She paused, waiting for Jimena to look up. When she did, her eyes were filled with tears. He'll leave you. He'll abandon you for being a burden in our lives. Jimena felt a chill run through her body. That's not true. Regina sighed and gently stroked her hair in a gesture so cruelly sweet that it made Jimena tremble. It will be if you want it that way. Jimena swallowed and looked down. I won't say anything. Regina smiled. Good girl. She closed the door behind her and the house fell back into silence. Far from there, in a hotel miles away, Gale was reviewing documents on the screen of his laptop when someone knocked on the door of his room. He frowned and got up to open it. It was the hotel receptionist, holding an envelope. They left this for you at the front desk, sir. Gale took the envelope with curiosity. Opening it, he found a folded sheet of paper inside. The message was brief. It's not what it seems. It's not the first time. Gale's heart began to beat faster. He looked for the sender on the envelope. There was none. Just a handwritten name in the corner. Donna Teresa. A shiver ran down Gale's spine. Donna Teresa was the neighbor next door. The woman who had always been kind to Jimena. The woman who had never had a reason to write to him. Until now. Gale dropped the note on the table and felt the anxiety take over him. It's not the first time. The words sank into his mind like poison. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep that night. And for the first time in his life, he feared he had made the worst mistake by trusting Regina. The anxiety kept him from closing his eyes all night. Gale stayed in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind repeatedly turning over the words from Donna Teresa. It's not what it seems. It's not the first time. The words echoed like a curse chant, making him feel like an abyss was opening beneath his feet. He got up before dawn, grabbed his phone, and booked his flight back. He didn't wait until the end of the week. He couldn't stay there, pretending everything was fine when a part of him screamed that something terrible was happening at his home. When he got to the airport, he tried calling Jimena, but she didn't answer. He tried again, this time on the house line. Nothing. A cold sweat slid down his back. After endless hours of flying and a taxi ride that felt eternal, he finally arrived home. The air at the entrance was heavy. Regina's car was parked, but the house seemed empty. He inserted the key into the lock with trembling hands and cautiously pushed open the door. Absolute silence. He dropped his suitcase on the floor and moved slowly through the living room. Something didn't fit. There was an odd calmness in the air, as if the house had been emptied of life. He turned his head toward the hallway. Jimena's bedroom door was closed. "Zaim?" He called, but his voice sounded strange in the stillness. There was no response. He pressed his lips together and headed for his study. He sat down in front of the computer, turned on the screen, and opened the program that allowed him to access the hidden cameras he had installed before leaving. The video began to play. Gale sped up the recording to the day after his departure. His heart stopped when he saw Regina's figure in the living room. She didn't have the sweet and understanding expression she showed him. Her face was a mask of disdain. He watched the video attentively. Jimena appeared in the shot, standing in front of Regina, with her head down and her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture. "Why are you standing there like an idiot?" Regina spat, her tone sharp and cruel. Jimena didn't answer. Regina stepped forward and grabbed the girl's arm with force. "I asked you a question." "I don't know," Jimena murmured. Regina laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "Of course you know. You're a problem. You're a burden. And you know what? One day your dad will realize that and leave you." Gale felt his blood boil. In the video, Jimena tried to pull away, but Regina held her tighter. "Does it hurt?" "Well, get used to it. Because from now on, things will be harder for you." Then, without warning, Regina's hand rose and slapped Jimena's cheek with a sharp sound. Gale shot up from his chair, it falling backward. On the screen, Jimena fell to the floor. Regina leaned over her and whispered something that the cameras didn't catch, but the girl's body shrank as if her soul had been ripped away. Gale felt his rage burning in his chest like a bomb about to explode. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the image of his daughter on the floor wouldn't go away. He couldn't just go out there and confront Regina without a plan. He couldn't risk her denying everything and twisting the story in her favor. He had to act smart. He decided to review the recordings from the following days. Jimena had stopped leaving her room. In the video, Regina passed by the door without even knocking. She didn't bring her food. She didn't try to talk to her. To Regina, Jimena simply didn't exist. Gale felt nauseous. He fast-forwarded to the previous night. Regina was sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, watching TV. Jimena hadn't shown up all day. Then, suddenly, the camera captured a sound. A slap. Gale rewound the recording. He heard something else, something that made him hold his breath. Jimena was crying. But her crying wasn't just a sob. It was a contained, silent cry, like someone who has learned that crying out loud only brings more pain. Gale squeezed his eyes shut and felt the rage tighten in his chest. He had to see his daughter. He hurried down the hallway and knocked on Jimena's door with his knuckles. "Zaim, it's me." "Open the door." Silence. He tried turning the knob. It wasn't locked. He slowly opened the door, and what he saw took his breath away. Jimena was on the bed, wrapped in her blankets, staring at the wall. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, her breathing barely noticeable. "Zaim?" He approached and touched her forehead. It was cold. "Daughter, talk to me." Nothing. Fear hit him with a crushing force. Jimena was there, but she didn't seem to be present. Her dark eyes were empty. Gale gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "Jimena, look at me." "It's Dad." "I'm here." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but not a single word came from her mouth. Gale felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. This couldn't go on. It was time to do something. And this time, he wasn't going to hesitate. The air in the room was thick with the uncertainty building up between them. Gale had tried to wake her, shake her, call her name, but Jimena didn't react. Her skin was cold, her eyes empty as if she was no longer in the same world. Her breathing was irregular, labored, and the pressure in Gale's chest was so intense it made it hard to breathe. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. "Zyme, please wake up," he whispered, his voice cracked. No one responded. Jimena remained there, motionless, as if her soul had left her body. Fear overtook him completely, and a chill ran through him. The sight of his daughter in that state left him paralyzed, not knowing what to do. How had it come to this? In a frantic impulse, he pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. His voice trembled as he spoke the words he never thought he'd have to say. "Please, I need an ambulance. My daughter is... she's very bad." Not responding, "I don't know what to do." The operator's voice quickly gave instructions. Gale hung up, never taking his eyes off Jimena, who lay in the bed like a stranger. A few minutes later, the sound of the siren filled the air, and moments later, the door slammed open. Two paramedics entered the room, and one of them, a woman with light brown hair tied back in a ponytail, quickly and confidently approached Jimena. "What happened?" the paramedic asked, looking at Gale. "I don't know," he said, his voice broken. "She was fine. She was in her room, and suddenly, she started to fade. She's not responding." The paramedic leaned over Jimena, assessing her breathing, checking her pulse. "She's in shock. She's suffered a severe nervous breakdown," she said calmly, but with concern in her voice. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Gale felt the world crumble even more. Every word the paramedic said only confirmed what he had already feared. Something terrible was happening to his daughter, something much deeper than he had imagined. "How did it come to this?" he asked, looking at the woman. The paramedic gave him a serious look but didn't answer. She only gestured for him to help move Jimena, while her colleagues prepared the equipment and the stretcher. Regina appeared at the door of the room. Gale hadn't heard her arrive, but he saw her standing there with a false expression of concern on her face. "What happened to Jimena?" she asked, approaching, her voice dripping with drama. Gale didn't look at her. He focused only on his daughter, who was being quickly carried to the ambulance. The paramedic accompanying her gave instructions for him to follow in his car so that they wouldn't delay the transport to the hospital. When they left the house and the ambulance disappeared into the distance, Gale stood for a moment at the door. He didn't know what to do. He felt his legs shaking. Every part of him was at war, torn between the desire to run after his daughter and the fear of what might happen. Regina slowly approached, as if she couldn't hide her anger. "This is your fault," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with indignation. "You're never here for her. Always busy, and now look what you've done." Gale glanced at her sideways. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mouth opened to reply, but he couldn't find the words. What he had just heard was so cruel, so far from reality, that his eyes narrowed in anger. "Don't talk about her again," he said, his voice firm, almost a whisper, but with the force of a scream. Regina looked at him in surprise, as if she hadn't expected that answer. But he couldn't take it anymore. His mind was a chaos of conflicting emotions. He had reached the point of not trusting anything or anyone. The woman who had been his wife, the one who had promised to take care of her, no longer seemed to have the slightest concern for Jimena's well-being. "I'm going to the hospital," he said simply. And without waiting for a response, he stepped out of the threshold and into the car. Rage and helplessness consumed him as the engine started. In his mind, the sound of the ambulance sirens echoed, and the images of Jimena, so fragile, so distant, invaded every corner of his brain. The hospital was cold, a structure that had always seemed so distant to him. In the hallway, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the voices of doctors and nurses. When he entered the emergency room, his heart was racing uncontrollably. "How's my daughter?" He immediately asked the first doctor who approached him. The man, wearing a white coat and glasses, looked at him seriously. "She's stable, but she's suffered a severe nervous breakdown. We'll need to run more tests to understand the extent of the damage." Gale fell silent. The word damage hurt him so much that a knot formed in his throat. How had it come to this? What had happened to his daughter? It was then that he saw the paramedic who had attended to Jimena at their home. "How is she?" Gale asked, his voice breaking. "She's out of danger for now, but her condition is very delicate. What she's gone through wasn't just physical, it was emotional. We don't know what triggered this breakdown, but it seems something very deep affected her." Gale nodded, but his thoughts kept drifting back to one point, Regina. Later, a nurse led him to the room where Jimena was. The young girl was connected to several monitors, her face showing complete desolation. When Gale looked at her, something inside him broke. Jimena, the lively girl he once knew, was now nothing more than a shadow of herself. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just lay there, as though absent from the world. It was then that a woman entered. It was the same paramedic who had been with Jimena at their home. Her name, according to her badge, was Mariana. She approached Gale with determined steps, but her eyes held something more than just professionalism. "She's not alone. She's not completely lost," Mariana said softly but confidently. "Jimena still has light inside her. She just needs to find it." Gale looked at her, confused. "How do you know that?" Mariana looked at him warmly, as if she understood something he didn't. "I've been watching. Jimena only reacted to me when I touched her, when I spoke to her. It's like part of her is waiting for something, but she can't break free." Gale didn't know what to say. How could this be possible? He had been so caught up in his own pain and fear that he hadn't stopped to consider the connection Jimena had with the paramedic. "How can I help her?" he asked desperately. Mariana looked at him with compassion. "This isn't something that can be cured in a day. She needs time, understanding, and, above all, someone she can trust. And believe me, she has the capacity to trust you, but you need to guide her. She can't do it alone." At that moment, something inside Gale lit up, as if he finally understood the gravity of what he needed to do. Mariana was right. He had been so focused on the guilt, on Regina's actions, that he had forgotten the most important person of all, his daughter. When Mariana left the room, Gale stayed by Jimena's side. He couldn't leave her alone. He knew that, no matter how much pain consumed him, he had to be the pillar of support his daughter needed. And for the first time in a long time, he understood something fundamental. His life would never be the same, but he could still save what he loved most. Gale stayed by Jimena's bedside for hours, motionless. He watched her breathe with difficulty, her pale face immersed in a sleep that seemed more like a prison than a refuge. He wondered if his daughter would ever be the same. The girl who used to run to hug him when he came home from work, the one who laughed when they played at the park, the one who had once been his whole world. But now only fragments of her remained. And he had been so blind that he hadn't seen how those fragments were shattering, one by one. The sound of the bedroom door opened softly, and Gale looked up. Mariana entered with a serene expression, holding a notebook in her hands. She approached the bed and checked Jimena's vitals on the monitor screens. "She's improving," she said in a calm tone, not taking her eyes off the girl. "But she's going to need a lot of support when she wakes up." Gale nodded without speaking. He felt a weight in his chest that prevented him from forming words. Mariana turned to him cautiously, as if carefully choosing her next words. "I don't want to be invasive, but I need to ask you something." Gale looked at her, furrowing his brow. "Tell me." Mariana let out a sigh and crossed her arms. "Do you think your wife is a good person?" Gale felt his heart stop for a moment. "Why are you asking me that?" Mariana placed a hand on the railing of Jimena's bed and leaned slightly toward him. "Because since you arrived at the hospital, she hasn't shown up." Gale squinted. "She said she was busy with some things." Mariana interrupted him with a bitter smile. Your daughter is in the hospital after suffering a nervous breakdown, and her adoptive mother decides she has more important things to do. The comment hit him like a punch to the chest. He hadn't thought of that, but Mariana was right. Regina hadn't shown up. She hadn't asked about Jimena, nor had she tried calling. She'd only accused him of being the culprit, then disappeared as if none of this affected her. Gale clenched his fists and felt the rage rise in his body like a fire burning him from the inside. I need to leave. Mariana looked at him curiously. Where to? Gale stood up, feeling a renewed energy in his body. To my house. I have something to fix. When Gale arrived, the house was completely silent. He set the keys down on the table and walked firmly to his office. He turned on the computer and opened the recordings from the hidden cameras. He knew what he was going to find, but he had to see it with his own eyes before acting. On the screen, Regina appeared walking through the house with a glass of wine in her hand, with that air of superiority she had always had. Then, the image changed, showing Jimena in the living room, standing in front of Regina with her head bowed. You're a burden. A problem that will sooner or later disappear from your father's life. Gale felt his hands tremble over the keyboard. Regina leaned over Jimena and whispered something in her ear. Jimena curled up, as if her whole body wanted to disappear. When he gets tired of you, he'll beg me to help him get rid of you. Gale squeezed his eyes shut and gritted his teeth. His breathing was heavy, his whole body filled with a hatred he had never felt before. He stood up abruptly and left the office. Regina was in the living room, the TV on, and her phone in hand, as if nothing had happened. Gale stood in front of her. Turn that off. Regina looked up with an irritated expression. What's going on now? Gale felt his voice come out firmer than he expected. I've seen the recordings. Regina blinked. What recordings? Gale took the phone out of his pocket and pressed play. The sound of his own voice filled the room. You're a burden. When he gets tired of you, he'll beg me to help him get rid of you. Regina stood up suddenly. Did you record me? Gale put the phone back in his pocket. You have 10 minutes to grab your things and leave this house. Regina stared at him in disbelief, then let out a sarcastic laugh. You think you can kick me out? Gale didn't blink. I don't think so. I'm sure. Regina glared at him, her eyes full of fury. If you kick me out, you'll regret it. Gale crossed his arms. I already regret letting you into my life. Regina's face twisted into a sneer of hatred. You can't prove anything. If you go to the police, I'll say Jimena is a liar. Gale smiled coldly. Maybe you can fool a lot of people, but not everyone. Regina frowned. What are you implying? Gale pulled a folded letter from his pocket and tossed it on the table. This came into my hands at the hospital. Regina grabbed the letter and quickly read it. Her face went pale. Who gave you this? Gale took a step toward her. Mrs. Teresa. Our neighbor. Regina dropped the letter to the floor. It can't be. Gale stared at her. According to what it says here, you've already done something similar before. To another family. With another man and another girl. Regina fell silent. Gale took a deep breath and pointed to the door. I want you out of this house. Now. Regina looked at him with a mix of hatred and desperation. You can't do this to me. Gale shook his head. You've already done enough to us. Regina gritted her teeth. Then, without saying another word, she turned and stormed up the stairs, disappearing into her room. Gale stood in the living room, his chest rising and falling quickly. It was over. Regina would leave his life. But the damage she'd left behind, that would take much longer to disappear. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't a miraculous transformation, but the absence of Regina was felt as if someone had removed an invisible weight that had been crushing Gale and Jimena for years. The house, which had once felt tense, dark, and cold, was now in a state of fragile calm. Regina had left 2 days ago. Not without throwing empty threats, insults disguised as goodbyes, and one last look of contempt before closing the door behind her. Gale watched her leave without a trace of doubt on his face. He owed her nothing, and all that was left now was to focus on Jimena, to rebuild what Regina had tried to destroy. Jimena still hadn't spoken much. She spent most of her time in her room, but at least now she accepted the food he brought her. She sat on the edge of the bed, playing with the edge of her sweater, taking small bites of whatever he put in front of her. Gale didn't pressure her. He knew the words would come when she was ready. Every now and then, when he'd go into her room to check on her, he'd notice her eyes were slightly swollen, but he no longer saw that empty look that had frightened him so much in the hospital. It was a slow process, but he was willing to wait as long as it took. That morning, after leaving a bowl of cereal on the small table by her bed, Gale sat in the chair by the window and watched her discreetly. "How did you sleep?" Jimena didn't answer right away. She lifted the spoon, but instead of bringing it to her mouth, she let it hover over the bowl, deep in thought. "I don't know," she finally replied. Gale nodded. "Did you have nightmares?" Jimena gave a small affirmative gesture. "I don't remember what about." Gale watched her with a slight frown. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" Jimena shook her head. "Not yet." Gale smiled gently. "That's fine. I'll be here when you're ready." Jimena looked at him for a moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. Then she nodded and took a bite of her breakfast. It wasn't a long conversation, nor a great revelation, but for Gale, that small exchange meant everything. That afternoon, Mariana stopped by the house. It wasn't the first time since the hospital. She had become a familiar face, a presence that, in a way, had become essential in Jimena's recovery process. When Gale opened the door and saw her there, with her hair tied back and a serene expression, he felt a strange sense of calm. "How's she today?" Mariana asked, holding a bag with some food in her hand. "Better," Gale replied, stepping aside to let her in. "She's eating and slept a bit more last night." Mariana nodded with satisfaction. "That's good." They walked together into the living room, where Jimena was sitting on the couch with a blanket over her legs, flipping through a book without much concentration. When she looked up and saw Mariana, her expression changed subtly. It wasn't a full smile, but there was a slight spark in her gaze. "Hey, Zyme," Mariana greeted softly. Jimena put the book aside and settled more comfortably on the couch. "Hey." Gale silently watched the interaction. He realized that, since the hospital, Mariana was the only person Jimena seemed to lower her guard with. Mariana sat down beside her and pulled something out of the bag. "I brought you this. They're oatmeal cookies my mom makes. They're not too sweet, but they're good." Jimena looked at the bag with curiosity. "Did your mom make them?" Mariana nodded. "Yes. I told her I have a friend who needs to regain her strength, so she made them especially for you." Jimena carefully picked up a cookie and took a bite. "They're good," she admitted after a moment. Mariana smiled. Gale, who had been watching everything from the doorframe, felt a lump in his throat. Watching his daughter interact, even shyly, brought a relief he didn't know he needed. A few hours later, Mariana and Jimena were sitting in the backyard. Gale watched them from the kitchen window, not interrupting, not wanting to break the little bubble they seemed to have built. "Mariana," Jimena said after a while, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." Jimena hugged her knees and looked at the ground. "If my dad makes another mistake with another woman, what will happen?" Gale's heart stopped. Mariana didn't respond immediately. She leaned a little toward her and held her gaze. "Your dad has learned. It won't happen again." Jimena bit her lower lip. "How can you be so sure?" Mariana exhaled softly. "Because he loves you too much to make the same mistake twice. And because you will never be alone again." Jimena blinked, surprised. "Does that mean you'll always be here?" Mariana smiled at her tenderly. "If you want, yes." Jimena looked down, but Gale noticed her lips curve slightly into a small smile. He felt something inside him settle. Mariana wasn't just helping his daughter. She was also fixing something inside him. That night, when Jimena went to bed, Mariana stayed a little longer in the house. Gale walked her to the living room and poured her a cup of tea. "Thank you for everything you do for her," he said, leaning on the table with his hands clasped together. "I don't know how you do it, but Jimena seems to trust you in a way she doesn't trust anyone else." Mariana looked at the cup in her hands before answering. "I've never felt this way about anyone," she confessed quietly. Gail looked at her with curiosity. What do you mean? Mariana lifted her gaze and their eyes met. This bond, feeling like I have a real purpose. Like I can make a difference in someone's life. Gail didn't know what to say. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but heavy with meaning. Mariana looked away as if she'd revealed too much. Sorry, I didn't mean to sound dramatic. Gail shook his head. You don't need to apologize. She held his gaze for another second, then set the cup on the table and stood up. I think it's time for me to go. Gail stood up as well. I'll walk you to the door. They walked together in silence to the entrance. Mariana stopped at the threshold and turned to him. See you tomorrow. Gail nodded. See you. Mariana smiled before turning around and walking to her car. Gail watched her walk away, his mind filled with thoughts he wasn't sure he wanted to decipher. But one thing he knew. His life was changing, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. The air in the house had a different calmness. It wasn't just Regina's absence, nor the fact that Jimena was slowly regaining some of her shine. There was another presence that filled the empty spaces, bringing something Gail hadn't felt in a long time: warmth. Mariana was there almost every day. Sometimes she stayed in the afternoon helping Jimena with her homework. Other times she brought homemade food that, even though Jimena always said she wasn't hungry, would end up eating without complaint. She had become a constant, a support not only for his daughter, but for him as well. But Gail didn't want to think too much about what it meant. He didn't want to acknowledge what he felt every time Mariana laughed with Jimena in the garden, or how her presence made his chest feel lighter. He had trusted a woman before, and almost destroyed his daughter in the process. That night after dinner, Mariana stayed a little longer. Jimena had fallen asleep on the couch with her head resting on a pillow, and Gail and Mariana were in the kitchen, with coffee cups on the table. You never told me why you decided to become a paramedic, Gail said, looking at his cup as he turned it between his hands. Mariana paused for a moment. I guess I've always wanted to help people. Gail looked up. That's what everyone says when they're asked why they chose something. Mariana smiled a little, but it wasn't a full smile. I lost my sister, she said quietly. Gail felt a small jolt in his chest. I'm sorry. Mariana shook her head. It wasn't an accident or a sickness. It was something like what Jimena went through. Gail set his cup down on the table and leaned slightly toward her. Do you want to tell me? Mariana sighed and rested her elbows on the table. My sister was younger than me. She was only 9 when it all started. My mom was dating a man at the time. A man who seemed perfect at first, someone who made her laugh, who treated her well. But little by little, he started to change. Gail felt a knot form in his stomach. At first, it was small comments, things that made my mom feel like she wasn't enough. Then the criticism started on us. That my sister was too restless, that I talked too much. Little things, but constant. Mariana paused, looking at her cup as if she might find a way to continue in it. Then the punishments started. If we did something he didn't like, my mom punished us, but not because she wanted to. She did it because he convinced her it was the right thing to do. And when that stopped being enough, he started doing it himself. Gail closed his eyes for a moment. Did your mom allow this? Mariana nodded sadly. I think at first she didn't even realize what was happening. She was so blinded by him, so convinced he was right, that she didn't see what he was doing to us. Until it was too late. Gail swallowed. What happened to your sister? Mariana crossed her arms and hugged herself. She couldn't take it. Gail felt a shiver. She left, said Mariana, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't go on. The silence that followed was heavy. That's why you became a paramedic, Gail said after a moment. Mariana nodded. I didn't want anyone else to go through what she went through. Gail felt something stir inside him. You've helped more than you think. Mariana looked at him with a small smile. Really? Jimena adores you. Mariana looked down, but he noticed there was something in her expression, something that told him she was also holding on to Jimena in a special way. She's amazing, said Mariana. She's strong, much stronger than she thinks. Gail watched her for a moment. The way her hair fell over her face when she looked down, the way her hands moved slightly when she spoke. He hadn't thought of anyone else since what happened with Regina. He hadn't allowed himself to. But Mariana. He didn't want to feel what he was feeling. He didn't want his heart to open again, not after everything. But there it was. His fear. His desire. His conflict. "Gail," said Mariana softly, as if she could read his mind. "You don't have to be afraid." He let out a sigh. "I don't know if I can trust again." Mariana gently tilted her head. "I think you can." Gail looked into her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he believed she might be right. After dinner, Jimena went to her room, but not before giving Gail a hug and saying goodbye to Mariana with a smile that months ago would have been impossible to imagine. Gail watched her calmly walk up the stairs, without the weight on her shoulders she used to have. No tension in her jaw, no fear in her eyes. The house, which used to be a place of shadows and awkward silences, now breathed differently. Gail felt it in every corner, in every conversation with his daughter, in every moment Mariana was near. He stayed with Mariana in the living room, in that space that had slowly become a safe refuge, a meeting point where words didn't have to be forced and silences didn't need to be filled with something superficial. "You didn't think it would end like this, did you?" said Mariana, with a slight smile as she wrapped her hands around a cup of hot tea. Gail exhaled with a mix of relief and nostalgia. "No." Mariana looked at him with curiosity. "How did you think it was going to end?" Gail stayed silent for a few seconds. "When everything started falling apart, I thought I was going to lose everything. I thought Jimena would never trust me again. That I'd never be able to fix what Regina broke." Mariana watched him attentively. "But you didn't lose it." Gail glanced at the stairs. "No, and I think that's what scares me the most." Mariana raised an eyebrow. "Why does that scare you?" Gail turned his face toward her and looked at her with an expression full of honesty. "Because for the first time in a long time, I have something to lose again." Mariana didn't take her eyes off him. "That means you have something to fight for." Gail smiled sadly. "That means that if I mess it up, it'll hurt more than anything else in my life." Mariana tilted her head slightly. "You're not the same man who let Regina into his life. You're not the same father who didn't see what Jimena was going through." Gail sighed. "I don't know, Mariana." She moved a little closer until their knees almost touched. "I do know." Gail looked at her, and in that moment, he realized that it no longer made sense to resist the inevitable. For months, he had fought against the feeling, against the idea of allowing himself to feel something for someone after everything that had happened. But Mariana wasn't Regina. And he knew that the moment Jimena trusted her smile to her before to him, there was silence between them. Not an awkward silence, but one full of meaning, of promises that hadn't been spoken out loud yet. Mariana placed the cup on the table with a smooth and controlled movement. "You don't have to be afraid to be happy again." Gail watched her, feeling his chest fill with something he had forgotten existed. "What if I don't know how to do it?" Mariana smiled at him tenderly. "Then we'll learn together." Gail didn't respond. Instead, he did something he had feared doing for months. He leaned slowly toward her, watching every reaction, every change in her expression. Mariana didn't pull away. And when their lips met, everything that had been broken inside him began to heal. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, nor of desperation. It was a kiss of relief, of certainty, of finding a home in someone else. When they pulled apart, Mariana looked at him with a serene smile. "That wasn't so bad." Gail laughed softly. "I could get used to this." Mariana leaned slightly toward him. "That's the idea." Gail took her hand in his. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't terrify him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that happiness was no longer an impossible price to pay. Upstairs, Jimena slept peacefully without fear, without the weight of the past on her shoulders. And in the living room, in the warmth of a home rebuilt from the rubble, Gail and Mariana looked at each other with the certainty that love, when it's real, always finds a way to heal. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting touching stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We deeply appreciate having you here with us. You can click the links that are appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. A hug.